I am Kathleen Weiss. I am the director of the Writing Center at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. And I'm here with my co-presenter, Angela Zito. She is a faculty associate working in the Writing Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And our presentation today is called When Learning Outcomes Mask Learning, Probing Assumptions about Writing Assessment in the Age of Learning Analytics. So can everybody see the slides okay? Okay, great. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Let's see. All right, so in February and March of 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic exploded around the globe, colleges clamored to move their worlds online, hoping to save not only the lives of their students, but the quality of their education as well. Administrators and teachers looked to online applications like Zoom, Google Classroom, and Canvas, to name a few, to help bridge the physical distance separating teachers from students. Now, a year and a half later, these digital tools have become mainstays in the academic world, much more so than they were previously, at least for most of us. And many of these programs offer more than a space to house digital materials. They offer data and data-driven mechanisms for assessing student learning. These so-called learning analytics are at the heart of my presentation today. So to understand how and why these digital tools for learning analytics first made their way into the classroom, we have to look back much further than the pandemic. Let's start 15 years ago. In 2006, the U.S. Commission on the Future of Higher Education released a report interrogating and criticizing American universities for failing to adequately prepare students for the demands of their future career. The report's authors claimed, as other nations rapidly improve their higher education systems, we are disturbed by evidence that the quality of student learning at U.S. colleges and universities is inadequate and in some cases declining, end quote. They noted that this is a crisis not just of learning, but of institutional transparency, explaining that the current lack of useful data and accountability hinders policymakers and the public from making informed decisions and prevents higher education from demonstrating its contribution to the public good. University administrators across the US have since scrambled to collect and analyze student data that can be used as evidence of the educational rigor of their programs, and this demonstrate that students at their institutions are actually achieving those desired learning outcomes. But compiling the data necessary to analyze an entire institution's educational outcomes is a large, complex endeavor that requires significant labor and resources. So to make this a more manageable, affordable, and efficient endeavor, many administrators started turning to learning analytics, a type of educational big data, which includes the measurement, data collection, data analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their context. So for this presentation, I'm going to use learning analytics to refer to any tools or methods that use automated algorithms to make meaning from large and complex sets of data or big data that is generated from user activities in a digital learning environment. So to deploy learning analytics at the institutional level, universities needed educational data, right? They needed that big data, and not just demographic data or enrollment data. They needed data that was generated in the classrooms themselves. Fortunately, for some universities, there was already a trove of educational data being generated and stored from students' online activities while using their institution's learning management systems, or LMS. These are also known as course management systems. These are online learning systems and platforms that are designed to create and host digital learning environments for both face-to-face and online courses. And because LMS are typically designed for university-wide implementation and are thus used in courses across the disciplines, across the colleges, more often than not, a university's LMS is also its largest and most comprehensive repository of educational data. So LMS first became popular following the turn into the 21st century when open source LMS with internal networks like Moodle and then Blackboard were introduced into the higher education marketplace. For administrators, the introduction of LMS technology offered new, albeit expensive, opportunities for streamlining educational and institutional operations using data-driven decision-making. According to Hamish Coates, equipped with the data infrastructure afforded by an LMS, administrators could, quote, reduce course management overheads, reduce physical space demands, enhance knowledge management, unify fragmented information technology initiatives within institutions, expedite information access, set audible standards for course design and delivery, and improve quality assurance procedures. Essentially, LMS promised to empower university administrators with a, quote, a hitherto undreamt of capacity to control and regulate teaching, quote. Now, the LMS that are the most successful are those that are pitched by developers and educational associations as the state-of-the-art data-powered mechanisms for helping administrators, educators, and students increase educational accessibility and foster student success while simultaneously streamlining course management and data mining efforts. As recent scholarship critiquing the big data boom in higher education has shown, however, once programs are integrated, LMS almost always fall short of their initial promises. In much of the research that covers these data-driven assessment technologies, the limitations of learning analytics are framed as temporally bound problems that will be solved once technology inevitably progresses. But by focusing our critiques on the limitations of today's technology or the improper application of LMS programs, we leave unquestioned the assumption that these assessment technologies actually have the capacity to accurately and adequately measure student learning. I argue instead that the promise at the heart of learning analytics, namely that it will make learning more personalized while simultaneously holding institutions accountable to concrete standards, is necessarily unfillable because their underlying algorithmic structures for analyzing data are incapable of accounting for the complex and multifaceted realities of student learning. So in the rest of this presentation, I'll be looking at an example of a software through which learning analytics are being deployed to enhance student learning and facilitate data-driven learning outcomes assessment. In tracing the process of translating user data to allegedly successful learning outcomes and the deformation of learning that occurs as a result, I'll show how the mechanisms underlying learning analytics work to decenter critical and intentional pedagogy in favor of quick algorithmic judgments. These methods, I argue, enact new contexts for teaching within which difference is framed as a barrier to student success and ultimately learning. So first, let me explain a little bit about how learning analytics work. Learning analytics essentially use an algorithmic process that relies on data that's mined from user activities on a platform. This is also called student-generated data. That data the data that is used is drawn from things like assignment submissions, exams, quiz answers, as well as data mined from online activities such as page views, clicks, and timestamps. The machine learning algorithms can then sift through all this data to identify traces of student learning that can then be aggregated across assignments in a course, across many students in a single course, and across many courses in an institution, so that they can be used as evidence of individual learning performance and level of engagement. And these algorithms are primarily used to make predictions about and to assess student learning. So learning analytics is methodologically contingent upon the belief that an objective measure of student effort and learning can be gleaned from digital traces or data. In 2012, the US Department of Education released a report called Enhancing Teaching and Learning Through Educational Data Mining and Learning Analytics. And they claimed that learning analytics could, quote, predict students' chances of success by comparing data said to represent a student's digital engagement with predetermined standards for what a successful or unsuccessful student's individual digital engagement should look like. Using these measures, they argued that teachers could distinguish between students who are not trying and those who are trying but still struggling, and then differentiate instruction for each group. But this claim assumes that educational data that has been mined and analyzed is wholly representative of an individual student's experience and engagement with digital material. Such an assumption prevents obvious blind spots and problems of representativeness. For instance, the data points that get counted as learning do not clearly map onto disciplinary understandings of what learning looks like. Further, the programs and data infrastructures undergirding learning analytics systems can't account for students or educators whose activities don't register as digital signals. So the problem here isn't that there is not enough data, or that the analysis isn't sophisticated enough, or that these systems are just preliminary attempts to use tools that will eventually, with greater refinement, accomplish the task set before them. Instead, the problem is that assessing learning with these technologies demands that learning itself be redefined and reconfigured so as to be measurable by such a tool. So although the initial promise of learning analytics is grounded in rhetorics of personalized learning, this promise comes with the caveat that the mechanisms through which they are deployed place constraints around what can be counted as learning. While all methods of assessment necessarily require that learning be reshaped to fit the assessment model, the process of reshaping learning is more exaggerated when using learning analytics for data-driven learning outcomes assessment. And it's less clearly connected to common learning goals like critical thinking and deep reading. So to put this into perspective, I want to reiterate some examples that they provide of the types of data points that are collected. Minutes spent on a unit, hints used, and common errors, not necessarily things that we would see as correlating to learning goals like critical thinking and deep reading. So just as instructors have to reshape their instructional materials and pedagogical approaches to fit within the predetermined structure of their institution's LMS or any other learning analytics-based application, students too have to make adjustments to how they approach the learning process. So these patterns of refitting and reshaping learning to meet the demands of an LMS's predetermined structure creates a feedback loop. And over years of continued use and refinement of educator and student behavior to meet its constraints, the system creates data and thus motivates those behaviors that are the most amenable to the data generation and analysis functions it has been designed to fulfill. Importantly, the system never realigns itself with the student learning outcomes that it was originally intended to measure and refine. Data thus becomes an end to itself. So to more clearly illustrate what qualifies as learning in a learning analytics context, and thus more clearly illustrate the risks that these systems pose for how we understand learning, I want to turn to a discussion about the data infrastructure and instructional practices behind the most popular and fastest growing LMS for higher education in the US. This is Instructure's Canvas. It was developed and launched in 2011 by for-profit company Instructure. And Canvas is a cloud-based LMS that's marketed for K through 12 and higher education contexts. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this LMS. When it first came out, it was really popular because it was the first cloud-based LMS to be released into the market. And while it's not currently the only cloud-based system, now it has kind of got the jump on other LMSs. So in the years following Canvas's release, while other LMS providers struggled to integrate similar data functionality into their services, they were able to make their way to the forefront of LMS technologies. It's the fastest growing LMS on the market. More than 40% of higher education institutions in the US use it. So one of Canvas's premier features is, and why it's so popular, is the tools that it provides for data analytics. Marketed as being like Moneyball for student success instead of baseball, referencing the wild success of the Oakland A's data-driven roster in 2002, Canvas's analytics are designed to serve a number of different functions aimed at bettering the quality of student education. And explanations of the potential benefits that universities can reap from using Canvas's analytics, the feature that Instructure emphasizes most is the LMS's capacity to help identify quote unquote at-risk students, which the program defines as quote at risk of dropping out of a course, program, or institution, unquote. The main mechanisms through which instructors using the Canvas LMS are supposedly able to identify at-risk students are through course analytics features, which includes compilations of data from all the students in a single course or students in multiple sections of course. And the student analytics feature, which includes data from individual students enrolled in a course. So both the course analytics and the student analytics rely on user-generated data, and those are presented to instructors as data visualizations representing student engagement and progress. So Canvas's data visualizations take the form of bar charts, line graphs, and various other graphical representations of data. And while the course and student analytics are largely similar in their graphic representations, they also offer a student context card, which is going to be the heart of my analysis here, which includes a more simplistic view of an individual student's analytics. So in addition to providing the student's grade, number of missing and complete assignments, and grades on the 3 most recent assignments, it includes a section titled Activity Compared to the Class. And as the image on the slide shows, these activities are represented as 2 3-star rating visualizations that show the individual students' page views and participation data in comparison to their classmates. So both of the minimalist star rating data visualizations are offered to instructors without any details as to what exactly these mean. There's no evidence of the mechanism, data, or methods used in their production. While the data used to construct the page views visualization is relatively straightforward in terms of what is being rated and compared, i.e. the number of discrete page views from each student's account, which are made available to instructors in another way through a log that has time-stamped each time a student has access to Canvas page. But the data that the participation visualization is meant to represent is not as implicitly clear for instructors using the context card feature. So despite the lack of explanation or context, however, the familiarity and the clarity of the star rating system grants the data visualization rhetorical power, encoding a particular kind of student success as a nudge to instructors. But what counts as success and how success is represented in the context card feature is very much dependent on what is encoded into Canvas's algorithm. And while Canvas doesn't provide an explanation of the context card mechanism on the Canvas portal, they do explain it on their Canvas community website as a simplified overview of a student's progress. It's based on grades from the course book, from the course gradebook, and standard page view and participation activity and course analytics. So to actually create those participation scores, Canvas's system compares the data that each individual student's account activity generates with the equivalent data from their classmates' accounts. So this list shows some of the user actions that generate the data that the participation analytics are based on. Once data has been generated, it's then aggregated and fed into an algorithm that scores student participation in relation to their peers. The resultant participation scores are then presented to instructors as these 3-star rating systems labeled participation. So the explanation provided on the Canvas community website for this participation feature also includes an important qualifier that isn't visible elsewhere as to the quality of the data represented in the context card feature. Canvas's mobile app is not configured to collect data generated by student activities and actions. So in other words, because the algorithm used to create student analytics can't account for the mobile app's limited data functionality, any student who's mainly using the Canvas mobile app, which may be for a number of reasons, from individual preference to having limited access to Wi-Fi or a laptop or desktop, their student analytics will be skewed. In the space where student generated data might appear given mobile functionality, there will instead be potentially significant gaps in logged activity. So when their data is run through Canvas's predictive model, these students can potentially receive lower participation and page view ratings than their peers whose activity data has been successfully harvested via the Canvas desktop website. While instructors may be able to account for these gaps in some other way, for instance, by asking students which type of device they're going to be using to access Canvas, and then taking the device type into consideration when assessing participation, this correction is pretty unlikely given the fact that these issues in data quality aren't made readily apparent to instructors who are using these functions, these analytic functions on their Canvas course page. It's also worth pointing out that by posting the explanation of the context card on a page external to Canvas's website, developers are working against their own narratives that LMSs are self-contained systems. Even if instructors were able to find and access the information posted on that external Canvas community website, they would be hard-pressed to find details about how Canvas's learning analytics work. So just as Canvas's analytics fail to account for data generated with the mobile app, they also inevitably fail to account for non-digital activities. For instance, if a student downloads course assignments and the syllabus, or prints out a PDF of course material, they may return to that printed or downloaded document many more times throughout the semester, right? But because their page view and participation will only show that they have visited the page once, Canvas's analytics will rate that student's activities as being less than, say, another student in the course who only accesses course material via a web browser. So these largely unaddressed issues with the quality and evenness of student data are quite problematic, especially considering that Canvas posits its course and student analytic features as capable of predicting and preventing at-risk students. Consider the following hypothetical example. An instructor using Canvas notes that a student has been automatically flagged by the system's course and student analytics feature as potentially at risk. So it does this by, say, highlighting their name in red in the gradebook. The instructor can then click on the student's context card and see that according to the system's analytics, the student has a low page view ranking, say 1 star out of 3, and a low participation ranking, say 2 stars out of 3, and has not submitted anything for an assignment that is now overdue. So if the course is small enough in terms of student enrollment, and if the semester is far enough along that the instructor knows all of those students personally, the instructor might realize that the student hasn't shown up to class for the past few sessions, and wanting to investigate further, they check the student's activity records and find that the student hasn't generated any new data for 2 weeks. So assuming that this means the student hasn't accessed their Canvas page for the same period of time that they've been absent from the class sessions, the instructor could triangulate that perhaps the student is experiencing some distress and send a follow-up email. But if the class is large, or it's early in the semester, or the instructor isn't familiar with the student, the likelihood of them recognizing the student as being at risk drops significantly. Now imagine there's a student who's been attending class regularly, who has been checking her course Canvas page frequently, but she's been checking her course frequently because she experiences perpetual anxiety about her performance. And so she's generated a lot of data on the Canvas website. She's not flagged by the system, and her high participation and page view rankings mask her real degree of at-riskness, preventing the same kind of outreach that the more obviously struggling student would receive. So there are a number of factors that can contribute to a false positive or negative in Canvas's analytics. It could be mental health, it could be technical difficulties or limitations, group work, or offline analog work. Identifying and correcting a false positive or negative is difficult, however, given how Canvas's course and student analytics are structured. And while analytics for individual students are made available to instructors, those same analytics aren't available to students. So students cannot see the data that they themselves have generated. They can't see their participation and page view stars. On the one hand, this opacity could be a benefit because students are less likely to game the system by artificially inflating their data, but it poses an even larger ethical dilemma. Without disclosing the types of assessment mechanics of the Canvas website to students in the course syllabus, for example, students may not be aware of how or even that their digital behavior is influencing not only their instructor's perception of them, but potentially their course grade as well. So leaving students unaware of how their activity is being represented to instructors renders them unable to address inconsistencies, errors, or gaps that may arise across their own Canvas data. So questions about the quality of data are rarely at the forefront of institutional discussions around LMS adoption. The lack of attention being paid by students and instructors towards the big data end of Canvas is in part a product of the way that data privacy policies get configured in LMS software. So for students, informed consent of LMS data practices and policies becomes tacit upon enrollment. When universities subscribe to a particular LMS, they're not only giving consent for their own institutional data to be harvested, but they're also granting consent on behalf of their staff, faculty, and students. This practice of granting consent by proxy raises important ethical issues around data practices, especially in terms of what data is made visible and for whom. So these issues are compounded when we consider the issues with data quality that I talked about earlier, namely that many students and instructors are unaware of the data being collected. So over the past few years, some schools have begun using their LMS software as a tool for detecting cheating retroactively. by using data mined during exams and without student consent. In this recent New York Times article, Natasha Singer and Aaron Krolik investigated Dartmouth's use of the LMS Canvas as a tool for detecting academic dishonesty. They found that Dartmouth Medical School had accused 17 students of cheating with evidence that had been identified using automated systems for gathering user activity data. And Singer and Krolik explained that while some students may have cheated, technology experts said that it would be difficult for a disciplinary committee to distinguish cheating from non-cheating based on the data snapshots that Dartmouth provided to accused students. And in an analysis of the Canvas code, the Times found instances in which the system automatically generated activity data even when no one was using a device. All right, so it's important to recognize that while not all instructors may be currently using learning analytics to track and assess student learning progress, and while some of these features are not yet perceived as critical to the system's functionality, as we become more familiar with the Canvas platform and begin to facilitate more of our teaching via the Canvas LMS, there may be more widespread uptake among educators of features like the student context card. And I would say that this is true throughout the pandemic as we're kind of getting more and more reliant on these systems. So as high enrollment courses and online only courses become more prevalent, their instructors may find themselves ever more inclined to use Canvas's learning analytics to gauge their students' progress and effort. And their assessments will be, whether they know it or not, tied directly to the capacity of the LMS to track and analyze student data. And LMS are not pedagogically neutral technologies, but rather through their very design, they influence and guide teaching. Without more educator and learner oversight, Canvas itself is likely to shape teaching towards the kinds of things that Canvas values, which risks amplifying the negative effects in terms of non-intended ways of learning. So data-driven learning assessment and learning analytics more broadly necessitate that higher education agencies, including instructors, students, and administrators, try to normalize not only what success looks like in the classroom and university, but also how students can move across educational spaces and how instructors can engage with students. The standards of success built into LMS and other learning analytic equipped platforms are grounded in subjective claims with real material consequences. And as Trevor Pinch argues, quotes, standards are rarely simply technical matters. They're powerful ways of bringing a resolution to debates that might encompass different social meanings of a technology. Standards are set to be followed. They entail routinized social actions and are in effect a form of institutionalization, end quote. Not only does this limit the visibility of non-digital actors, but it simultaneously promotes a fabricated perspective of student experience because the algorithmic outputs of the system are always already contingent on subjective agencies that produce the parameters for data interpretation, which often don't include faculty. Despite the myriad conveniences learning analytic platforms provide for instructors, especially in terms of streamlining the management and distribution of course materials, the reliance on algorithmic structures for analyzing data will always fail to account for the complex and multifaceted realities of student learning. Far from revealing the realities of student learning, learning analytics creates and deepens blind spots around how instructors can best see student learning, all while fostering misconception about what counts as learning in the classroom. As a mode of assessment, learning analytics, with its reliance on predetermined standards for assessing learning and opaque methods for surveilling student work, ends up constraining rather than empowering student learners. All right.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. So I'll pick it up from here. If you all give me a moment while I share my screen. Kathleen, could you give me a thumbs up if you see my title screen? Thanks so much. Okay. So again, my name is Angela Zito. I'm a faculty associate with the Writing Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm speaking to you today from Madison, which is home to the Ho-Chunk Nation, or the people of the big voice, and they have called this land Tejope since time immemorial. So I want to pick up from where Kathleen left off in suggesting that Kathleen's research opens an introspective moment for us in WAC, to which I am relatively new, just FYI. It's an opportunity for us to collectively interrogate the promise at the heart of WAC, specifically that teaching with writing is a high impact practice that can deepen student learning in and across disciplines. So in my presentation, I want to ask, to what extent do disciplinary ways of writing posit metaphorical algorithms of their own? How do they pose structures of assessment that can conceal as well as reveal student learning? So I want to start with something that we know about writing, that it can and does facilitate thinking and deepen understanding, kind of calling back to these threshold concept that writing is a cognitive activity. And another thing that we know, that students engage in critical thinking and writing within academic disciplines, which have, over the course of their histories, developed discourse community practices that set predetermined standards for what kinds of writing, communicating, or knowledge building are effective or successful. So in this presentation, then, I want to ask, to what extent do disciplinary writing conventions obscure fundamental and often early stage ways of thinking in a discipline, especially as those conventions take shape in closed form genres? So in other words, as a mode of assessment, how might the predetermined standards of disciplinary genres cut out of view desired learning outcomes? So I'm coming to these questions because of findings from research that I conducted some time ago in 2016, 2017, that I've been mulling over ever since. It was a literary studies project in Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. Lit Studies is my home discipline. And this research wanted to interrogate perceptions of and practices in assessment among instructors in introduction to literature courses. These are general education literature courses that were open to all students across majors, across standings. Largely, it was students who were not English majors enrolled in these courses seeking to fulfill a general education requirement. So I interviewed 18 instructors in Intro to Lit courses, including both faculty and graduate teaching assistant instructors. The questions that I asked focused first on disciplinary values, asking folks to talk about what value they saw in reading literature or in literary study, what purpose they understood Intro to Lit course to serve in higher education. And I also asked them to talk at length about the student learning outcomes that they had for their Intro to Lit courses and the means of assessment that they used to observe those learning outcomes. That's where writing comes in, as you'll see. My analysis took a grounded theory approach, and my analysis used a combination of process coding and close reading analysis of the interview transcripts. So from that research, I developed three sort of emerging theories, grounded theories about disciplinary assessment and literary study. The focus of this presentation is on that third one, something that I've termed writing reading, with reading struck through and slightly obscured. But I do want to walk briefly through the first two theories just to provide a fuller picture of this phenomenon that I'm trying to think through, and that I hope you all will think through with me. So the first theory to emerge from my interview data was that Intro to Lit instructors tended to use skills language to describe learning outcomes. And this proved to be somewhat troublesome language, in that it posed a threshold, a conceptual threshold, a boundary between what they described as hard skills and soft skills. So basically, instructors would use skills to describe both what they described as concrete kinds of learning or hard skills, which tended to fall within a category of cognitive learning. So things that they would describe as critical thinking skills or analytical writing skills. They would also use skills language to describe what they characterized as more abstract kinds of learning. And these tended to fall within the category of affective learning, ways of being in the world, ways of valuing. And so these would include some learning outcomes like empathy or responsible citizenship. So what the really tricky, kind of troublesome thing was with skills was that while talking about different kinds of skills offered a way in for these instructors to describe affective learning outcomes, which were often the ones that they most highly valued, instructors would largely fall back on language that sounded more concrete, that they felt would appeal to students and other stakeholders more because they kind of called on that hard skills kind of valuation. So while an instructor might really desire an affective learning outcome like developing a capacity to empathize with others, that outcome would be coded as a hard skill like critical reading or analytical writing, because that would sound something more like what students and their parents and administration would want to hear. So the second theory to emerge from my data analysis was about how instructors sought to observe those most valued or those most desired learning outcomes, usually those affective learning outcomes. And their approach was to intentionally not assess that learning, which was really, really interesting and a little concerning to me, we'll say. So I developed this concept of holding out to capture this common impulse among intro to lit instructors to intentionally not communicate, not teach, and not assess the learning outcomes that they thought were the most important. So holding out suggests both holding out on intro to lit students because the instructor is withholding something important about their learning outcomes. But it's also holding out against intro to lit students because it's based in this perception that students don't share the same values as the intro to lit instructors. So here's an example of an interview response that illustrates some aspects of both these two emerging theories about troublesome skills and this idea of holding out. So Marion, who is a graduate TA, said, I think in English, the different way that we learn how to become well-rounded citizens of the world, which was a kind of affective learning outcome she had said, is that we're taught that things are texts, which means that they're created structures and that thinking through them helps you understand the world because everything is in a sense a text, right? It's a set of skills that you learn to think about why things are the way they are, because you're thinking about the abstract structure of them rather than the concrete causes and effects of things. And I've always found that a very valuable and powerful way of making sense of the world. She continues, but having said that, I could never say that out loud to a large group of potential undeclared majors because that's so abstract and that doesn't sound like what anyone wants to take away from their college education. I think it's almost something that in hindsight you think, oh, that was the real value of it. But in the moment you're thinking, this is making me a really good writer. It's like hoping that you plant some sort of seed that lays dormant within them. And maybe years later, as they go off into their first job as whatever investment banker, they suddenly realize, oh, this is what that meant all those years ago. So this is what I see happening, is that Marion is holding out against a culture unsympathetic to her values through and possibly with her intro to lit students. So first we see that she elects not to share her most important or valuable learning outcome. She says, I could never say that out loud. She's withholding that from students. She then obviates conflict between her values and stakeholders' values, especially her students, when she says that that doesn't sound like what anyone wants to take away from their college education. And ultimately, she relies on hope. She hopes that students will arrive at a desired way of thinking on their own. So rather than assessing whether that outcome is achieved, just hoping that it will be. So that's all just kind of backdrop, some context for thinking about this third emerging theory that came up through my data analysis, which is this idea of writing reading. And this is getting at the idea that when these intro to lit instructors do engage in assessment of student learning, it occurs primarily through graded writing assignments meant to capture students' ability to conduct close readings of texts. So most instructors would assume that formal writing assignments are the ideal venue for students to demonstrate their achievement of otherwise unseen reading outcomes. For instance, wrestling with unfamiliar language or investigating multiple possible interpretations of a text, or even contending with worldviews that are in conflict with their own. So by partially obscuring the word reading in presenting this concept with that strike through reading, I propose that intro to lit instructors evaluative emphasis on students' writing in this closed form disciplinary genre of the literary analysis essay, that it ultimately conceals early stage reading outcomes that are fundamental to literary studies discourse community practices. I'm going to elaborate on that. So in my remaining time, I want to walk you through the major learning outcome that instructors sought to assess, which I've termed reading for complexity. Then talk through how they felt that reading for complexity would be observable through this closed form genre, the literary analysis essay. And then I'd like to invite you all to think with us, with Kathleen and myself, about what implications these findings might have for WAC research and praxis, especially in the age of learning analytics. So part of my analysis of the interview data was to develop an outcomes map that categorizes the many learning outcomes that participants identified in their interviews. There were two major outcomes categories: reading literature and reading the world, that defined the single learning outcome that all instructors sought to teach and assess, which is what I have called reading for complexity. So reading literature and reading the world, which in the image on the screen right now, I've circled along this vertical axis in the outcomes map. These are distinct but inextricable categories that define the reading practices characteristic of literary studies, of the literary studies discourse community as it takes shape at this institution. So reading is thus theorized in these instructor interviews as a continuous oscillation between navigating complexity in literature, in the texts that students are reading in class, and in navigating complexity in the world, the historical contexts in which those texts were produced, or the contemporary context in which students are reading with them. And so this oscillation between reading literature and reading the world makes it so that engaging in one practice either reflects or anticipates the other. So this term, reading for complexity as an outcome, seeks to capture that movement between both kinds of reading. So now when asked how they can observe and evaluate student learning in their courses, all of the instructors who participated in my study identified writing assignments as the primary means. Now, significantly, I didn't ask participants how they evaluate students' reading capabilities. I didn't ask them, how do you assess reading for complexity? But, oops, I'm sorry. Something just came across my screen and now I need to exit out. Go away. Okay. Right, so I didn't ask them how they evaluate reading for complexity. Rather, I asked how they see and assess the major learning outcomes that they had described previously in that conversation. And this is significant because while some instructors explicitly connect the kinds of reading that they want students to learn to what they want to see in student writing, those who don't make that explicit connection still made that connection implicitly by describing successful student writing with the same language that they use to describe successful reading. This is important because it further underscores the centrality of reading as the learning outcome for these intro to lit instructors, that the one that they most value, that they most desire to see, even if its observable processes are cut out of view in instructors' assessment practices. So even if they don't realize that what they're wanting to look for in student writing is evidence of reading for complexity, that is what they're looking for based on their descriptions, on how they describe what it is that they're looking for. Okay, so participating interrogate instructors located evidence of students reading for complexity most frequently and in most detail in one particular kind of high stakes academic writing assignment, which was the literary analysis essay. They did talk about lots of other genres of writing, both low stakes and high stakes kinds of assignments. I identified 8 different kinds across the interviews. But what's important about the prevalence of the literary analysis essay is that it suggests instructors perceive this genre to be their most effective assessment tool, since their most specific descriptions of student learning are tied to this one genre. So what strikes me as more important still is the fact that the majority of participating instructors did not identify the literary analysis essay as a particular kind of genre of writing chosen specifically to assess students' capacity to read for complexity. Rather, most instructors discuss students' literary analysis essays as just writing generally, the assessment of which they believed would simultaneously evaluate students' capacity to read for complexity and to write those readings out. I know this is something that we have seen fairly consistently, fairly often across WAC research, this idea that faculty in the disciplines may view writing in their discipline as writing. Good writing is good writing. But within the literary analysis essay itself, when asked to describe yet further how they see student learning in their writing, instructors universally identified sophistication of analysis as evidence of students reading for complexity. What they meant by that specifically diverged around whether they emphasized sophistication of thought or sophistication of expression. Some instructors sought to tie these two understandings together under the term analysis, and yet others sought to extricate those two. So I have a couple of examples, an example of an instructor who seems interested in sophistication of ideas, and an example of an instructor who is interested in sophistication of expression. And seeing that time is short, I think I'll read through these examples and then leave you all with some questions. So forgive me, I think I've lost the presentation here. There you go. So Jamie, a faculty instructor, wanted to emphasize sophistication of ideas. He said, I think you can actually evaluate and assess reading for complexity on the basis of 2, if you want to use this word, which I hate, metrics. The kind of questions that students start to ask of texts. So for instance, students often start asking questions that are universalizing. How does this text say something about what it means to be a good mother or what it means to live a good life? Instead, they start to ask questions like, how does this movie provide a variety of ways of understanding responses to environmental crisis? They start asking questions that are more historically focused and actually more interesting for that. And the second, Jamie continues, is the richness and the complexity of the analyses that they provide. The word I use is generosity. You can start to see students do more generous analyses. Initially, most students want to take one of polarizing approaches. They either buy into the ideology of a text completely, and so they are trying to make a convincing case for why the most messed up ideologically bad elements of a text are good, or they're complete ideology readers. They're like, this whole text is evil and it's evil to its core, boom. You can tell that students are becoming more ethical and more empathetic when they begin to really engage with the fine-grained nuances of a text as itself being contradictory, having multiple ideologies operate at once and doing different things for different viewers. Like, you can just see that in the analysis. So through Jamie's description, we can get a sense that he's imagining an iterative reciprocal process of reading and writing that leads to the desired learning outcomes. He doesn't point to specific structural features of the literary analysis essay as evidence of students reading for complexity, but he teases out the substance of their ideas. On the other hand, Lee, another faculty instructor, really focuses on sophistication of expression. She said there are some big kinds of intellectual growth that might be hard to measure that have to do with abstract thinking and an ability to step back from one's own ideological assumptions and look at one's own culture and so forth with more analytic perspective. But there are also some more concrete skills that we hope to be cultivating, and these are also tied to very important thinking skills because writing is an essential part of these courses. Most of the grading reflects written work, and good writing requires clear thinking, and it requires logical thinking and logical presentation of ideas. And if you can get students to make headway in effectively organizing paragraphs and effectively organizing arguments, you really have changed their thinking skills, I think. To this, I posed the question, do you have a sense that it's also possible to gauge that kind of intellectual growth, like those larger conceptual learning goals that you were saying are more difficult to identify or measure? To which Lee replied, I think those would be reflected in the analytic work that students did, but it's not as easy to, she pauses and thinks, I think it's easier to just look at a paragraph and say, look at the flow. Does this logically follow from this? Has this been defended? So on and so forth. Is the material that's used to defend it appropriate, adequate, etc.? Whereas this kind of conceptual growth, it's going to be there in the sophistication of the thinking, but it's harder to pinpoint. So from this description, Lee seems to propose a much more linear and transparent connection between students reading for complexity and the sophistication with which that reading is expressed. This is far more common than what I tended to hear in Jamie's description. Lee's description was more common than Jamie's description. This idea that the structural features of the genre, thesis statement, topic sentences would be presumed to be adequate stand-ins for the reading outcomes that students would exercise before and throughout their composition process. So I'll just leave off with some questions. I'm so sorry not to leave more time for discussion here at the end, but as I mentioned, I'm fairly new to WAC, and I'm eager to think with you all about potential implications these findings have for WAC research and praxis. So for instance, is this idiosyncratic to intro to lit courses or instructors, or is there the potential for other closed form disciplinary genres to misalign with desired student outcomes? Is this something for WAC practitioners to be particularly aware of in consultation with gen ed courses and instructors? Or is this have something to do with the potential for faculty development around writing to learn and how it intersects or diverges with writing in the disciplines? And of course, how are any of these questions compounded by concerns about learning analytics that Kathleen had proposed earlier? So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. So we have about 7 minutes left. Open it up for any questions anyone has, or if anyone wants to jump off some of the questions that Angela posed. You can feel free to unmute or type it in the chat. Yeah, Doug, do you have a question?
Sure, thanks. I'm sorry, there's a lot of street noise. I'm in my office and I'm next to a lot of ambulances right now, it seems. I was really struck in the chat. There were a couple of us batting around the idea that a paper may function in the same way as data analytics. That is, because of the power of writing and writing across the curriculum, we're willing to extrapolate, I think as Angela was making a really interesting point, all sorts of things that perhaps we can't extrapolate from that. That's just a comment, but you know, I'd be interested if you could make anything of the sort of analogy that we're chewing around here. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I definitely see the analogy working, and this is one of the things that, as we were kind of proposing this panel, we were talking a lot about how disciplinary ways of thinking and writing are in some ways algorithmic structures of their own, where we're choosing you know, what is important, what is valuable, what we want to see, and in that way it's revealing and concealing what isn't selected as well. So yeah, I definitely can see you know, papers being kind of like us, how we're assessing writing, being like we're applying our own algorithmic lens to this. Yeah, so I love that connection that you were all making.
And just to add to that, it's not lost on either of us the ways in which these quote unquote algorithms are racialized in ways that many of our colleagues have compellingly demonstrated through predetermined standards at the level of the sentence, as well as at the level of a whole closed form genre, just based on the white language supremacy and whose voices and whose bodies have been in play in these disciplines, establishing what discourse community practices are quote unquote legitimate. So there's still that huge element that I know for my part I'm still thinking through.
Yeah, Pamela.
Yeah. Hi, thanks, both of you. These were both really wonderful talks. And I guess what I wonder is, in answer, Angela, to your question, is this something that we see in other disciplines? We certainly have seen some of the characteristics and perceptions that you're seeing in Intro to Lit across the curriculum. And I guess I'm interested in thinking in both of your cases about whether some of these roadblocks or these obscuring factors can be pursued fruitfully with faculty by investigating beyond some of the good questions that you asked, Angela, pursuing it more to help faculty reveal to themselves that that's not really what they think, that they really know that things go beyond that other things are incorporated in what students are expected to be doing. And it's not quite as glib and skill-based as they may think that it could be conveniently termed. So whether these can be pursued and change can be catalyzed through more conversations. Is that something that you've been thinking about?
Absolutely, and certainly something that I've been wanting to engage in as someone who's just sort of making way into WAC practice and actually consulting with faculty across disciplines. It's something that I'm eager to do, but also something that I'm anxious about. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with in conversations of your own, that there may be the anticipation of some pushback at the point where it's just easier. Like I have this genre, I have this assignment that has worked well enough, and maybe at some point it's just not, I don't know, not feasible or not time effective or like time efficient enough to actually engage in those maybe messier conversations around what it is that we really want to see, or that we really want students to be learning, and what might be the most ethical ways of actually seeking to observe that learning. But I want to see if Kathleen maybe who has vastly more experience as a WAC practitioner than I do.
Well, I would say that, I would say the same thing of we become attached to our disciplinary ways of thinking and writing. And pushback against that I could definitely kind of see that happening. But I think it's important and I think WAC is really at a really wonderful position to be the people who are kind of bringing these things to people's attention. So just as people who can cross disciplinary boundaries and are seeing these different learning goals, but also are thinking critically about just learning as just what does student learning look like. I think starting these conversations is definitely within the WAC world. Yeah.
Thanks, both of you. A model that we use called Writing Enriched Curriculum works with that. And I would just add that I think underlying some of the simplicity and the facility is fear, that faculty feel they don't really know how to work with diagnosing complex, nuanced student writing abilities. And so there can be a partnership that's both supportive and kind of interrogative.